There is a moment sharp as a splinter of glass when a person understands that the ground beneath them was never solid. Not a crumbling, not a slow erosion. Just the sudden, terrible knowledge that what they were standing on was air, and has always been air. And the only thing that kept them upright was the mercy of not knowing. Evangeline Marsh understood this on the 42nd night. She was standing in the dark of the equipment barn, a lantern held low in her left hand, the small wooden box open in her right. She had made this same walk every night for 6 weeks, past the split-rail fence, through the gap in the stone wall where the mortar had crumbled, into the barn that smelled of hay and axle grease and the cold that had begun to settle into Wyoming like a permanent tenant. Every night she had opened the box. Every night the contents were there. Tonight the box was empty. She stood very still. The lantern flame did not waver. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge in long, low sweeps, dragging loose straw across the packed earth floor. A horse shifted in its stall. The timbers of the barn ticked and groaned the way old wood does when the temperature drops hard after sundown. Evangeline Marsh did not move. She was thinking. 6 weeks earlier, she had stepped off a westbound train at the Granger Depot, wearing a borrowed name, a ring that had belonged to another woman, and carrying inside that box something capable of destroying the most powerful man in Wyoming territory. She had come because she had nowhere else to go, and because she had made a promise to a dead man. Both of those things were still true, but now the box was empty, and she knew exactly whose hands had been in it. She closed the lid. She set the lantern on the ground. She sat down in the straw with her back against the wall, and her knees drawn up, and she breathed. Just breathed. Because what came next was going to require everything she had, and she intended to arrive at it with a clear head. Let us go back. Let us go back 6 weeks to a train platform in a town where no one knew her name. South Station in Boston smelled of coal smoke and human urgency. It was the 3rd week of September 1889, and the morning light came through the high windows in cold columns that did nothing to warm the concourse. Evangeline stood at the far end of the platform, nearest the westbound tracks, and did what she had been doing for the past 4 minutes. She burned a piece of paper. Not in a furnace or a hearth. She had done it the only way available to her, which was to hold the corner of it against the glass chimney of a public lamp until the flame caught, then turn the paper, slowly feeding it to the fire with the calm precision of someone who had made a decision and did not intend to revisit it. The name on the paper was Eleanor Voss. It was the name printed on her train ticket. When the last corner turned to ash, she let it fall to the platform floor and stepped back. She had been Evangeline Marsh for 26 years, wife for one of them, widow for 3. She intended to be Evangeline Marsh again when this was over, but for the journey she would need to be someone else. She had chosen the name from a courthouse record in Providence. The woman it belonged to had died in 1881 and had no living relatives. The train was already breathing at the platform, its boiler a low, constant pulse. Evangeline picked up her 2 bags, one heavy, one heavier, and walked toward it without looking back. She was not a woman who looked back. Her husband, Thomas Marsh, had taught her that. Thomas, who had spent 12 years as a private inquiry agent, who had taught her to read a room before she walked into it to identify who in a crowd was watching and who was being watched. To understand that what a person chose not to say was almost always more important than what they said. Thomas, who had spent the last 18 months of his life coughing blood into handkerchiefs that Evangeline washed and ironed and folded and placed in his drawer, until one morning she came in with the basin and the cloth, and there was no longer any reason to. He had left her with very little, a small flat in Cambridge, debt, and a locked box. Inside the box, a collection of documents that Thomas had assembled over the course of 2 years working a case he had never been formally hired to work. Ledger copies, correspondence in a careful, slanted hand, a receipt signed by Douglas Hale, acknowledging payment for services rendered to a party whose name had been deliberately obscured, and most damning of all, a letter on Douglas Hale's personal stationery, dated November of 1874, instructing a man named Orrin Peck to see to it that the matter of the Whitmore testimony is resolved before the new year. The Whitmore testimony never happened. Samuel Whitmore, a land surveyor from Laramie, died in a riding accident 3 weeks after that letter was written. Thomas had found all of this from a distance, through intermediaries, through the painstaking assembly of fragments that individually meant nothing, and together meant everything. He had never been to Granger, Wyoming. He had never met Douglas Hale. But he understood what Hale was doing, and he understood what the consequences would be if no one stopped it. He had tried to tell Evangeline why it mattered to him. She had listened. She had held his hand. And she had understood in the way that people understand things they cannot fully explain. That for Thomas, this was not a case. It was an accounting. When he died, she had sat with the box for a long time. Then she had begun to make arrangements. The train west passed through towns that grew smaller and farther apart, as if the continent itself were losing confidence. Springfield, Albany, Cleveland, Chicago, where she changed trains and ate a sandwich in a station that smelled of river water and industry. Then west again through the flat immensity of Nebraska, where the land was so level and so vast that the horizon seemed less like a feature of the landscape than a physical law. She had a private compartment paid for with money borrowed from a woman in Providence named Ruth Calcott, who was the widow of a freight agent and who had her own reasons for wanting Douglas Hale's affairs examined in a federal court. Ruth was not the only one. Over the past year, working through a quiet correspondence that never used Hale's name directly, Evangeline had found 4 other women in 3 states who understood what she was carrying and why it needed to reach the right hands. None of them could make this trip themselves. Roots, children, health, fear. Evangeline had none of these things holding her, which was the kind of freedom that comes from having lost everything that could be lost. She slept fitfully. She checked the box each morning when she woke. She ate little and read less and watched the country change outside her window from prairie to high plain to the first blue suggestion of mountains on the western horizon. She thought about Douglas Hale exactly as much as she needed to, which was enough to keep her sharp, and not so much that it became something else. She thought about Aldous Garrett, the federal circuit judge, who would be traveling through Granger in late October to oversee the territorial preparations for Wyoming's pending statehood. She had 11 days to put the documents in his hands. before he moved on. She thought about Calhoun Briggs only once on the second night. As the train climbed into the foothills and the air outside the window turned from amber to cold blue. She had read his advertisement twice before responding to it. Most of the notices in the marriage columns were brief to the point of erasure. A man's age, his acreage, his requirements in a domestic partner rendered in the flat language of a livestock transaction. Briggs's notice was different only in its brevity in a different direction. It said he needed someone capable of hard work and independent judgment, that the country was remote and the winters severe, and that he was not a man given to ornamentation. There was no mention of loneliness, no suggestion of romance, no promise of anything beyond a working arrangement and a roof. She had answered it because it read like a man telling the truth. She was not here to become his wife. She understood that. She intended to stay long enough to meet Garrett, deliver the documents, and leave. What came after that was a problem she would address when she reached it. She fell asleep with the box against her side and the mountains growing in the dark outside the glass. The Granger Depot was smaller than its name suggested. A low frame building with a covered platform, a hand-painted sign, and a water tower that had begun to lean slightly east, as if considering retirement. The train arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon, and the light was already going golden in the way of autumn light, at elevation amber and horizontal and full of dust. Evangeline stepped onto the platform and identified 3 things in the first 10 seconds. The mountains to the north, which were closer and larger and more absolute than she had been prepared for. A buckboard and 2 horses tied at the far end of the platform, unattended. And a man standing near the station door, who was watching her with the specific quality of attention that belongs to someone who already knows who they are looking at. He was perhaps 50 thick through the shoulders, dressed in a dark wool suit that was too fine for the occasion. His hat was good. His boots were better. He held them with the ease of a man accustomed to quality, and he was watching Evangeline with a warm municipal smile that did not reach his eyes. He was not Calhoun Briggs. She knew this the way she knew most things about people before they introduced themselves, which was that she paid attention, and they almost always told her, "Miss Marsh." He said it before she had crossed half the platform. Not a question. She stopped. She shifted the heavier bag in her right hand. She let him see her look at him, and she let the look be calm, because calm was the only armor she had, and she intended to wear it well. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure," she said. "Douglas Hale." He extended his hand. "Judge, 1st District Court of Wyoming Territory, and chairman of the First Granger Bank, though I wear that hat a good deal less ceremonially." His grip was dry and measured. "I hope your journey was comfortable." "It was adequate," she said. "Thank you." "Calhoun will be along shortly. He had a fence line to check this morning, and I'm afraid time gets away from a man when there's cattle involved." He gestured toward the station door, with the practiced courtesy of a man who had spent a great deal of his life guiding people in directions they had not chosen for themselves. "Can I offer you some coffee while you wait? There's a decent pot inside." She went inside because refusing would have required an explanation, and explanations cost information she could not afford to spend. He poured the coffee himself, which told her something. He asked about her journey in the particular way of a man who was not interested in the answer, which told her more. He mentioned Boston twice, and both times he mentioned a specific street Tremont near the courthouse district, in a tone of casual familiarity that was too precise to be accidental. She drank the coffee and told him nothing. She was good at telling people nothing. Thomas had said it was her greatest professional quality on the days when he was well enough to say things like that. When Calhoun Briggs came through the station door 14 minutes later, Evangeline understood two things simultaneously. The first was that Hale had been here before him deliberately. The second was that Calhoun Briggs had no idea. He was taller than she had imagined from the language of his advertisement, which was not a useful thing to notice, and she noticed it anyway. Lean in the way of men who work with their bodies without thinking about it, with a face that the sun and the altitude and some considerable interior weather had carved into a landscape of its own. His eyes were the gray of overcast sky above open water. He moved without hurry, but also without waste, which was a combination she associated with men who had learned the hard way that both carelessness and hesitation had consequences. He registered Hale first. Something in his expression adjusted fractionally, the way a door shifts when the wind changes. Then he looked at Evangeline and the expression settled into something more carefully neutral. "Miss Marsh," he said, not the warm performance of Hale's greeting, simply an identification. "Mr. Briggs, sorry for the delay." He said it the way men say things they are not particularly sorry about. "Mr. Hale kept me company," Evangeline said. He was very hospitable. Hale clapped a hand on Calhoun's shoulder in the manner of a man exercising a privilege that has long since been established. "I happened to be at the depot on other business. Glad I could be useful." He turned to Evangeline with that measured smile. "I hope Granger treats you well, Miss Marsh, and I mean that sincerely. Any friend of the Briggs family is welcome here." She thanked him. She meant none of it. She was quite certain he knew that. On the buckboard heading north out of town, she sat beside Calhoun Briggs in the particular silence of two strangers who have agreed to a significant arrangement and are only now beginning to understand what that might mean. The road climbed through stands of aspen that had gone gold and copper in the autumn cold, their leaves spinning and falling in the long light. The mountains ahead resolved from blue suggestion into specific ridgelines, specific faces of granite and pine. "Can you ride?" Calhoun asked. It was the first thing he had said since they left the depot. "I have ridden," she said. "Whether it would meet your standards is a separate question." He considered this. "We'll find out." She looked at the road ahead. "How long has Mr. Hale been a family friend?" A pause. Not long, but measurable. "He holds our note," Calhoun said. "First Granger Bank. Has since 1882. He said it the way a man says something he has made his peace with, even if the peace is not comfortable. In this part of the country that tends to make men friendly, whether they intend to be or not." She did not respond to that, but she stored it. The Briggs Ranch sat on a bench of land below the main ridge, positioned the way a man positions himself at a table with his back to the wall, and the whole room in view. The house was not large, but it was solid log and stone, with a covered porch along the south side, and a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for winter, with the attention of someone who intended to be there to wake it in spring. Nora Briggs was waiting on the porch. 58 years old, with white hair, pinned without ceremony, and the bearing of a woman who had decided a long time ago that she would stand up straight and stay that way, regardless of what life brought to her door. She had the Briggs eyes, that same overcast gray, but where Calhoun's were guarded, Nora's were measuring, active, taking inventory. She opened her arms to Evangeline with the warmth of a woman welcoming not just a person, but a possibility she had worked a long time to arrange. "Come inside," Nora said. "You must be exhausted, and I have beef stew and bread and a fire that means business." Calhoun carried in the bags without being asked. He set the heavier one down with the particular care of a man who has noted its weight and is deciding what he thinks about that. Then he went back outside to see to the horses, and Evangeline followed Nora into a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and something braised low and long, and the specific, undefinable smell of a house that has been lived in well. "He's not much for welcome speeches," Nora said, stirring the pot without looking at her guest. "In case you hadn't noticed." "I noticed," Evangeline said. "It's not coldness, it's caution. There's a difference even if it doesn't feel like one from the outside." "What does he have to be cautious about?" Nora turned from the stove, the measuring look again, more open, now more direct. "Same things most men are cautious about," she said. "Experience." She gave Evangeline the room at the end of the hall with a window that faced east toward the ridge and a small iron stove that she showed her how to manage. There was a chair, a washstand, a bed with a patchwork quilt that looked handmade and old and cared for. When Nora left, Evangeline set both bags on the bed and opened the heavier one. She removed the wooden box. She pressed the latch. She confirmed what she had confirmed every morning and night for the past 6 days of travel. Still there. She closed the box and placed it beneath a loose board under the bed that she had noted when she crossed the floor. The board required only a slight lift, and it gave a few inches enough. She pressed it back down. She stood. She went to the window. The ridge was turning rose in the last light, and the aspens on the lower slopes were moving in the evening wind, all that gold trembling like something afraid and beautiful. She had 11 days. The first week passed in the way of early winter at elevation, demanding and clarifying, stripping away whatever was unnecessary, and leaving only what could withstand the cold. She learned the kitchen in 2 days. Not quickly, not easily, but she had learned harder things. Calhoun's ranch ran on practical rhythms: breakfast before daylight work, until dark supper without ceremony. And she adapted to these rhythms because adaptation was something she had always been good at, and because there was work that needed doing and no utility in standing aside while it was done. She was a poor rider. She was honest about this, and it served her. Calhoun had neither patience for pretense nor the particular irritation that comes from misrepresentation. When she told him she could manage a horse in a basic sense and left it there, he accepted it in the same spirit. What she was not poor at was observation. She observed that Calhoun rose earlier than anyone else and returned from his first rounds of the fence lines before the rest of the ranch hands were at breakfast, that he kept a Winchester above the door to the equipment barn and a Colt on the high shelf in the kitchen, within reach but not displayed, that he read in the evenings the Cheyenne papers when he could get them, and one particular book he kept face down when she entered the room as though the title were private. She could see it was worn at the spine and well handled, but she never looked closely enough to read it. She observed that Nora watched her, Not suspiciously something more complex, the way a person watches something they have hoped for and cannot quite believe is actually present. On the 8th day, she found the newspaper. She had gone to ask Nora if she needed kerosene from the store in town, and Nora's door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, she could see the room as she always saw it tidy. Spare the few objects on the dresser arranged with precision. But on the small table beside the bed, where there had previously been only a lamp and a Bible, there was now also a folded newspaper, a Boston Globe. August 1889. Nora closed the door before Evangeline could see more. She did it quietly, without urgency. And when she opened it again 30 seconds later, her expression was entirely pleasant. "Kerosene," Nora said. "Yes. And pick up a spool of dark thread if they have it." Evangeline went to town. She bought the kerosene and the thread. She was calm on the road both ways, and she remained calm through supper. And it was not until she was alone in her room that night, the box checked and in its place, that she allowed herself to sit with what she had seen. A Boston paper. The August issue. On page 4 of that issue, in the court notices section, appeared the name Evangeline Marsh as a potential witness in an estate matter relating to the practice of Thomas Marsh, deceased inquiry agent. Nora knew her name, not just her face. Not her name. Her real name, not the one on the train ticket. Which meant that Nora had known before she arrived. She waited. She thought about it for 2 days, turning it the way you turn a stone in a stream, to see what is underneath. And when she had looked at it from all the angles available to her, she took it to Nora directly. It was after supper. Calhoun had gone to the barn. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire and the wind outside, and the 2 women sat across the table from each other in the lamplight. And Evangeline said without introduction, "You knew who I was before I got here." Nora wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. She did not look away. "Yes," she said. "You weren't fooled by Hale's arrangement. You chose me from it." "Yes." "Then I'd like to understand why." Nora was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of evasion, but of someone deciding how much of a long story to carry into the room and how to carry it. "I had a friend," she said at last, "in Providence, widow of a freight agent. She wrote to me last winter about a woman she knew of, the widow of a man named Thomas Marsh, who had been working quietly on matters related to certain land transactions in Wyoming territory." Nora set down the cup. "She said this woman might be coming west. She said she might need somewhere to land. And you made sure I would. I answered Hale's letter." There was something in her voice, dry, particular, that carried the weight of knowing exactly what she had done, and exactly what it had cost her to do it. "He sends me names from time to time. Women he's vetted for Calhoun, which I find patronizing, but the arrangement has allowed me to manage who actually comes through the door. When your name appeared, your husband's name connected to certain correspondence, I recognized I made sure you were the one selected." Evangeline considered this. "You weren't sure I still had the documents?" "No." "You weren't sure I'd be willing to use them?" "No." "Then what were you sure of?" Nora looked at her steadily. "That you were the last chance I was likely to get." She said it plainly without dramatics, and the plainness of it was what made it land. "Hale," Evangeline said. "Yes." "Tell me." And Nora did. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. 15 years of watching him dismantle the valley, the land deeds that transferred under pressure, the men whose notes the bank called in the winter when they had no liquidity and no recourse, the Whitmore matter which Nora had known about differently than Thomas Marsh had, not through documents, but through a conversation she had overheard in 1874 between Hale and a man named Orrin Peck, in a room in this house that had been her brother's study. Her brother, Calhoun's father. A man named Ira Briggs, who had died of what the county physician recorded as pneumonia in the winter of 1876. Evangeline said quietly, "Was it pneumonia?" Nora's hands were still around the cup. "He was 61 years old and he had been in good health his whole life," she said. "And he had recently told Hale he would not sell the North Quarter regardless of the terms offered." She paused. "I've never been able to prove it. I've never been able to prove any of it. That's why your husband's documents matter. That's why you matter." Then she coughed. It was not a dramatic cough. It was the kind of cough that belongs to something that has been present for a while and is being managed and only occasionally forgets to be managed. She turned away and pressed her hand briefly to her mouth, and when she turned back, her expression was composed. But Evangeline had heard it. She had heard it on 2 other evenings, faint and late, coming from the direction of Nora's room. She did not say anything about it. She filed it with the other things she was carrying. Outside, the autumn that had seemed merely cold was becoming something more serious. The first snow came on the 14th day, light and exploratory, but the clouds behind it had depth to them. The kind of depth that ranchers in that country read, the way other men read print. Calhoun spent the better part of 3 days moving cattle down from the upper pasture. He worked without complaint, and with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who understands that the land does not adjust itself to inconvenience. On the evening of the 16th day, he stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and looked at the sky and said without particular inflection, "Gonna be a real winter." Evangeline was at the table with her sewing. "How real?" "Frontier real," he said. "The kind that changes how you think about warm." She looked up at him. He was still watching the sky. In the lamplight, the lines of his face were particular and clear, and she found herself thinking not for the first time that he looked like a man who had been somewhere difficult and come back from it, and was not entirely sure what to do with himself in the aftermath. "You were a Pinkerton agent," she said. It was not a question. She had pieced it together from several things, none of them definitive on their own. He looked at her then. The gray eyes were measuring in a way that was different from Nora's, measuring more cautious, more accustomed to finding things that were not reassuring. "Was," he said. "Why did you leave?" A long pause. The fire shifted in the hearth. Outside, the first new snow was beginning fine as salt. "Because I did what I was told," he said, "when I should have done what I knew." He did not elaborate. She did not push, but the thing had been said, and it sat between them in the particular way of things that don't go away just because the conversation moves on. Later in her room, she checked the box. She lay down on the quilt and stared at the ceiling and thought about Aldous Garrett arriving in Granger in 26 days. and about Nora's cough, and about a man who had done what he was told when he should have done what he knew, and what it might mean that he had ended up here holding a debt to a man like Douglas Hale, living on land that might have been taken from his own father. She thought about all of these things until the wind outside settled into its working register, and the cold came under the door. Then she closed her eyes. She was 6 weeks and 5 days from Boston. She was 26 days from her window with Garrett, and she was in ways she had not anticipated, and was not certain she had names for, yet somewhere she had not been in a very long time. She was somewhere that felt against all logic and evidence like it might be worth fighting for. She did not examine that thought too closely. She let it rest there, quiet like a small thing that needed warmth to survive. And she slept. She found the work. That was the thing she had not expected. Not the cold, which was exactly as severe as advertised. Not the isolation, which had its own particular texture. Not empty, but concentrated the way wilderness is never truly empty, but full of a different kind of presence. Not even Calhoun's economy with words, which she had come to understand, was not indifference, but a form of precision. A man who said little meant everything he said. What she had not expected was to find the work and to find that it suited her. She could not ride well. She could not read weather the way the ranch hands read. It could not look at a cloud formation over the North Ridge and tell you what it meant for the next 3 days. She did not know which fence posts were solid and which were rotting at the base from last spring's wet. These things took years, and she did not have years. But she could organize. She could look at the disorder of a barn office where receipts and invoices had been stuffed into a wooden crate in roughly chronological order, and understand what needed to happen. She could sit for 4 hours with a ledger and reconstruct 3 years of accounts that had been kept the way a distracted man keeps accounts, accurately in intention and chaotically in practice. She could do this because Thomas had taught her, and because she had a mind that was comfortable with pattern and discomfort with disorder, and because the work gave her a reason to be in rooms where she could hear things. She heard things, not from Calhoun, who remained careful even in his own house, but from the ranch hands at breakfast who talked around her with the particular freedom of men who have decided a woman is furniture, from the occasional visitors, a neighboring rancher who came about a grazing dispute, a supplier from town who stayed for coffee, from the silence between Nora and Calhoun when certain names came up, which was itself a kind of information. She built a picture. It took time the way all pictures built from fragments take time. Douglas Hale had been in Granger for 22 years. He had arrived with capital and credentials and the specific confidence of a man who has studied a place before entering it. The bank had come first, then the judgeship, the two things reinforcing each other in the way that money and legal authority reinforce each other when they are held by the same hand. He was not cruel in any obvious way. He did not raise his voice. He did not make threats that could be quoted back to him. He simply made it clear in the manner of a man who controls the terms of debt. That cooperation was healthier than resistance. Most people cooperated. The ones who did not found that health was a more complicated matter than they had previously understood. The north quarter of the Briggs Ranch, Ira Briggs's north quarter, the parcel he had refused to sell, was the piece Hale still wanted. Evangeline understood this when she saw the tax records which Nora kept in a folder in the kitchen drawer, with the kind of grim organization of someone who has learned to document everything. The North Quarter sat on the only reliable water source on the east side of the valley. Without it, the land above was nearly worthless. With it, the entire eastern ridge became prime grazing territory, the kind of territory that would increase substantially in value when Wyoming achieved statehood and federal land grants began to formalize. Hale was not impatient. He was simply waiting, and while he waited, the banknote from 1882 sat on the books accumulating in its patient way, and Calhoun worked harder each year to service it, and the North Quarter remained the one thing that was not for sale. She understood the shape of it now. She understood why Nora had needed someone from outside, someone with no local debt and no local history, and nothing that Hale could hold. She was on day 20 when she began to be followed. It was nothing definitive. A man she did not recognize seen twice in town, on the same afternoon from different vantage points. A horse tied outside the post office when she went for the mail, and the same horse tied further up the street when she came out. She could not be certain. She had learned from Thomas that certainty was a luxury, and that acting on probability was not paranoia, but competence. She said nothing. She checked the box that night and moved it to a new location under a different board she had identified in the first week. She stopped going to town without a reason. She waited. Douglas Hale came to supper on the 22nd day. The invitation had come from Nora formally. As these things were done, a note delivered to the bank with the request that he join the family on Thursday evening. Evangeline had not been consulted. When she asked Nora about it, Nora said only that it was a courtesy that had been extended before, and that Hale expected it to continue being extended, and that a gap in the pattern would attract more attention than the dinner itself. She accepted this reasoning and spent the afternoon making cornbread. Hale arrived at 7. He brought a bottle of good bourbon, which told her the dinner was not a social call. Men who bring expensive gifts to meals they intend to be purely social do not calculate the gift this carefully. He complimented the house, the cornbread, and Evangeline's apparent adjustment to Western life in that order. And each compliment was precise in a way that suggested he had prepared them. He sat at the table the way he stood on the platform, as if the space had been arranged for his comfort specifically. The conversation moved through weather, through the condition of the road north of town, through the upcoming visit from the federal circuit court. Hale mentioned Judge Garrett's coming visit in the manner of a man noting a minor civic inconvenience. He said something about the paperwork involved in territorial transitions. He said that October was always a busy month. Evangeline helped herself to more stew and said nothing. After supper, Calhoun and Nora went to clear the kitchen, and Hale remained at the table, and Evangeline remained because leaving would have been conspicuous. Hale poured 2 glasses of the bourbon, which she had not asked for, and set one in front of her and said with the warmth of a man who has decided to dispense with the formal version, "I'm going to speak plainly if you don't mind." "I'd prefer it," she said. "I know something about Thomas Marsh," he said, "about his work, about the kinds of things he concerned himself with before he died." He said it easily, without edge, the way a man states something he has rehearsed until it sounds unstudied. "I want you to understand that I hold no animosity toward you. You've come a long way in difficult circumstances, and I think you found something here that has value." He paused. "I would like that to continue." She picked up the bourbon. She did not drink it. She turned the glass in her hand and looked at the color of it in the lamplight. "And what would make that easier?" she said. "Time," he said. "Patience. The understanding that some matters are better left to settle on their own, rather than being stirred up by people who, however well-intentioned, don't fully understand the local landscape." He smiled with the portion of his face designated for smiling, and the rest of him remained exactly as it had been. "Wyoming is going to be a state, Miss Marsh. Things are going to change. The right people in the right positions will make sure those changes benefit everyone, including the families whose land you've acquired." The expression remained precisely where it was. "Development raises all properties," he said. "That's not politics. It's economics." She set the glass down untouched. "I appreciate your candor," she said. She excused herself shortly after. She walked to her room and closed the door and stood in the dark for a moment. And then she lit the lamp and went to where the box was and pressed the board and confirmed it was there, and replaced the board and sat on the edge of the bed. He knew about Thomas. He knew she was here. He did not know about the documents. If he had known, he would not have been so careful with her. He would not have bothered with bourbon and plain speaking. He would have used something more direct. But he was watching. He was watching and waiting, and she estimated somewhere between 2 weeks and 3 before his patience became something else. She had 21 days until Garrett arrived. She went to find Nora. The wooden box came out of its place under the floor. Nora sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at what Evangeline placed in front of her, the leather packet inside the oilcloth, the documents arranged in the order. Thomas had assembled them, and her face did something complicated and private. The face of a person looking at something they have spent a long time hoping existed. "The letter," she said. Her voice was steady. "The one from November 1874. Third from the top." Nora did not touch it immediately. She looked at it through the oilcloth as if looking were enough for now, as if touching it made it too real too quickly. Then she pressed her palm flat against the packet and kept it there. "I heard him dictate it," she said. "I was in the hall. I was 20 years old, and I didn't understand what I was hearing, and by the time I understood, it was years later, and Ira was gone, and there was no one left who would have believed me." She removed her hand. "Your husband found it in Orrin Peck's estate after Peck died. Peck kept everything. Some men do that. They keep everything because they believe it protects them, and they don't understand that it only protects them while they're alive." Evangeline rewrapped the packet. "I have 21 days. I know. Does Calhoun know any of this about what you suspect happened to his father?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "He knows his father died with a debt to Douglas Hale and a refusal to sell the North Quarter, and that those two things were connected. He's drawn conclusions. He's not a man who requires everything spelled out." She paused. "But he doesn't know what I heard in that hall. I've never told him." "Why not?" "Because knowing and being able to do something about it are different conditions." She looked at Evangeline steadily. and because I didn't want to hand him a reason to do something irreversible. Evangeline thought about the Winchester above the barn door, about the Colt on the kitchen shelf, about a man who had left the Pinkertons because he had done what he was told, when he should have done what he knew. "We need to keep this from Hale for 21 days, she said. "After that, it's in Garrett's hands, and it doesn't matter what Hale knows." "I'm aware of the timeline," Nora said. "I'm also aware that someone in town is watching me." Nora nodded slowly. "There's a man named Sykes who works for Hale without appearing to work for Hale. He's been in Granger about 3 years. He tends to appear where things of interest to Hale are occurring. Describe him." She described him. It was the man Evangeline had seen twice outside the post office. "Then I stopped going to town alone," Evangeline said. "And I stopped doing anything that looks like looking for something." "What does that leave you?" Evangeline put the packet back in the box. She pressed the board down. "Looking like a woman settling into a life," she said. "Which I've been doing anyway." She was in the barn the next afternoon working through a supply inventory that had not been properly organized since the previous spring, when Calhoun came in from the east pasture. He unsaddled the horse and hung the tack without speaking, and she continued counting bolts of fence wire. And the silence between them was the comfortable kind that she had grown accustomed to, not empty, but occupied. "Hale talked to you last night," he said, without looking up from the bucket he was filling at the pump. "Briefly," she said. "What did he say?" "That he hoped my situation here would continue to develop favorably." She set down the clipboard. "And that some matters were better left to settle on their own." Calhoun was quiet. He carried the bucket to the near stall. "That's how he talks," he said, "when he's telling you something without telling you." "I know." He looked at her then. Something in his expression was assessing her more directly than usual. The way a man looks at a map when he's not sure he's reading the terrain correctly. "What did he actually want?" he said. "To know how much I knew," she said, "and to suggest that knowing less would be healthier." Calhoun leaned against the stall door. He crossed his arms and he looked at the middle distance for a moment. And then he said without inflection, "Is there something you should tell me?" She considered him. She considered the question. She thought about Nora's calculation. Don't give him a reason for something irreversible, and she thought about the 21 days and the documents under the floor, and the man named Sykes who appeared near post offices. "Not yet," she said. She expected resistance. She got instead a single slow nod, the nod of a man who has filed the answer and reserves judgment. "All right," he said. He picked up the next bucket. The work continued. On the 28th day, she fell off the horse. Not dramatically. Not dangerously. They were in the south field at a slow trot. Calhoun having taken it upon himself to continue her education in practical riding without either of them having formally agreed to this. And she leaned slightly wrong at a slight incline, and the horse adjusted. And she did not adjust fast enough and went off the left side into the dry grass with a completeness that left no ambiguity about the failure. She lay there for a moment, looking at the sky. Wyoming's sky at this elevation in late October was a color that had no adequate name, not blue exactly, more like the idea of depth rendered visible. A hawk was crossing it from south to north. Calhoun appeared above her, looking down. His expression was doing something careful. "How many times," she said, "before this stops happening?" "Depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether you're trying to stop the fall or trying to stay on the horse." She thought about this. "Those aren't the same thing." "No," he said. "They're not." He offered his hand. She took it and stood up. She brushed grass from her coat. The horse was standing 20 feet away, apparently unconcerned. They rode back at a walk, and in the lower field near the fence line they stopped, because the light was doing something particular to the mountains to the north, that late afternoon amber that arrived without warning and transformed the ordinary into something that required a moment of attention. The aspen groves on the lower slopes were bare now, the gold entirely gone, but the branches caught the light and held it in a different way, silver white and precise against the dark of the pine above. "My father planted the stand on the east end," Calhoun said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the trees. Said aspens were the only optimistic trees, always reaching. Never seem to know they're not the tallest thing in the forest. She looked at the aspens. She thought about Ira Briggs planting them and about what Nora carried in the hall of that memory and about a letter from 1874 in a box under her floor. "You were close," she said. "Not a question." "In the way that men are close," he said, "when they're not good at saying so." He was quiet for a moment. He was a stubborn man, would not be moved on certain things. I used to think that was a flaw. Another pause. I don't anymore. The light shifted. The moment closed. He turned the horse toward the barn. She followed. And in the silence of the return ride, something settled between them that had not been there before, not declared, not named, but present the way certain truths are present before they are spoken. That evening she sat on the porch after supper in the cold, because she needed the cold, needed the clarity it provided. And she looked at the stars that were coming out over the ridge, and she acknowledged to herself something she had been refusing to acknowledge. She did not want to leave. Not in the way she had expected to not want to leave. Not because the alternative was uncertain. Not because she had grown comfortable in a material sense, but because of the aspens. Because of a man who said things once and meant them. Because of Nora's particular form of courage carried quietly for 15 years. Because of this ranch on its bench of land, with its back to the wall, which had refused to be moved on certain things the way Ira Briggs had refused, and which was still here. She sat with this for a long time. Then she went inside and went to sleep. She had 13 days. On the 33rd day, she made an error. Not a large error. Not the kind that announces itself. The kind that seems in the moment like ordinary curiosity. She asked the man at the general store as casually as she could manage whether he knew when the Federal Circuit Court party was expected to arrive. She framed it as a domestic question. Something about needing to know whether to expect visitors, whether the hotel would be full. The kind of question a new wife might ask for ordinary logistical reasons. The man at the store said he'd heard late October couldn't be more specific. She thanked him and bought her thread and came home. 4 days later, Hale came. Not to supper this time. He arrived in the mid-afternoon on a Tuesday when Nora was at the church hall, and the ranch hands were in the east pasture, and he tied his horse at the post with the manner of a man who has timed his arrival. Calhoun was in the barn. Hale went to the barn. Evangeline was at the kitchen window. She saw him go in. She stayed where she was and kept her hands moving over the work in front of her and kept her breathing even. 11 minutes. Calhoun came back toward the house alone. He moved with his normal pace, which was not hurried, but there was something in his posture that had changed a particular set to his shoulders that she recognized not from watching him, but from understanding what it looked like when a man was carrying something new and had not yet decided what to do with it. He came into the kitchen. He did not look at her immediately. He went to the shelf where the coffee was kept and poured himself a cup and stood at the window she had been standing at looking out. In his left coat pocket there was something. The angle of it, the slight weight pulling the cloth, told her it was an envelope. She waited. "He made me an offer," Calhoun said, still looking out the window. "What kind of offer?" "The note," he said. "The banknote from 1882. He'll retire it. Full discharge." He paused. "In exchange for information about what you're doing here and what you brought with you." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire spoke intermittently. Outside, a gust came down off the ridge and moved through the bare aspens along the fence line with a sound like distant water. "He said he'd made a similar arrangement to me that he'd now like to formalize," Evangeline said, without being specific. "He was more specific with me." She looked at him. He was still looking at the window. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." He turned from the window then and looked at her directly the way he had looked at her in the barn when he asked if there was something she should tell him. The gray eyes were not cold. They were, she searched for the word, weighed, the look of a man with something on both sides of the scale. She made a decision. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She went to her room. She lifted the board. She brought the box to the kitchen table and she opened it, and she placed the leather packet in front of him, and she told him everything. She did not abbreviate. She did not manage the information or select the parts that would land most favorably. She told him about Thomas and the documents and the 11 days she had left before Garrett arrived. She told him about his father's North Quarter and the letter from November 1874 and what Nora had heard in the hall. She told him about Sykes outside the post office and the question she had asked at the general store and the 4 days between that question and Hale's arrival in the barn. She told him all of it, and then she stopped and waited. He did not speak for a long time. He looked at the packet. He did not touch it. He looked at the table and then at some middle distance, and his jaw moved slightly with something that was not words but was working toward them. When he spoke, his voice was low and had a particular quality, not anger, which would have been easier. Something more internal than anger. "My father," he said. Nora wasn't certain, Evangeline said carefully. She heard a conversation. "The documents don't prove what happened to your father specifically, but they establish what Hale was willing to order in 1874. And they establish a pattern that I know what they establish." He said it quietly. He said it in a way that told her he had on some level already known, not the specifics, but the shape, the refusal to sell, the timing, the winter of 1876. He looked at the envelope in his pocket. He took it out. He set it on the table beside the leather packet. He looked at both of them for a moment, the thing Hale was offering. and the thing Hale wanted destroyed. Then he pushed the envelope to the side with 2 fingers and stood up. "Show me where the board is," he said. "Why?" "Because I'm going to take the documents and you're going to keep the box where it is," he said. "When Hale comes back to ask if anything's changed, you're going to tell him the box is where it's always been." "Which will be true." She looked at him. "Where will you take them?" "Somewhere Hale doesn't know about." He picked up his coffee and finished it. "There's a place in the equipment barn, behind the wheel press. I've kept things there before that didn't need to be found." "And the envelope." He looked at it. "I'll give him an answer tomorrow," he said. "I'll tell him I've been watching and there's nothing unusual to report. That you're a woman from Boston who can't ride a horse and makes tolerable cornbread." He said it without inflection, but something in the delivery was deliberate. "That'll buy you a few days before he decides he doesn't believe me." "Why are you doing this?" she said. He put on his hat. He looked at her the way he had looked at the aspens in the fading light. Not with sentiment, but with the specific attention of a man who understands what he is looking at and is not going to look away from it. "Because he had my father convinced that debt was the same as obligation," he said. "And I'm done letting that be true." He took the leather packet. He went to the barn, and Evangeline sat at the kitchen table with the empty box and the envelope Hale had prepared, and she understood that the ground beneath her, the actual ground, the packed earth of this ranch that had refused to be sold, this bench of land with its back to the wall, was more solid than she had given it credit for. That night she heard it clearly for the first time. Not faint, not managed, not the controlled quiet she had been hearing for weeks from the direction of Nora's room. It was deeper than that. It lasted longer. She lay in the dark, and she counted the seconds between the sounds, and she felt the knowledge of it settle in her chest like cold water. She had known since the 8th day when she saw Nora turn from the stove with that particular quality of careful movement. She had not named it to herself because naming it required doing something about it, and she had not known until now what there was to do. She got up. She put on her robe. She went to Nora's door and knocked softly and waited. "Come in," Nora said. The lamp was low. Nora was sitting up in bed with a cloth pressed to her mouth, and her eyes calm in the way of someone who has been managing this long enough to have made a kind of peace with it. Evangeline sat in the chair beside the bed. She did not perform surprise, and Nora did not perform wellness, and the fact of that, 2 women in a room in the dark, not pretending, was its own kind of relief. "How long?" Evangeline said. "Since spring," Nora said. The physician in Cheyenne was specific about the prognosis and inexact about the timeline, which is the best a physician can do with this sort of thing. "Does Calhoun know?" "He suspects. I haven't confirmed it." She lowered the cloth. "He would stop working if I told him. He would sit with me and watch me, and that is not how I want to spend whatever time there is." Evangeline thought about the thing Nora had said in the kitchen that first week. "You've come a long way in difficult circumstances. I think you found something here that has value." She thought about how those words landed differently now. "The documents," she said. "You spent 15 years building toward this because you needed someone to carry it, and you're running out of time." "Yes," Nora said. simply, without self-pity, which was the thing Evangeline found most difficult about it, but at the complete absence of self-pity. "Then we finish it," Evangeline said. Nora looked at her. "I wasn't sure," she said carefully, "when I sent for you whether you would stay past the point when leaving became the safer option." "I'm not leaving." "I know." Nora's hands folded in her lap. "I knew when you sat down at that table and told Calhoun everything. A woman who intends to leave doesn't do that." Evangeline was quiet for a moment. "You heard. The house is not large. Outside, the wind moved over the ridge and came down through the aspens his father had planted, and the sound of it against the window was low and familiar and not unkind." 11 days, Evangeline said. 11 days. Nora agreed. Evangeline stood. She pulled the quilt higher on the bed. She extinguished the lamp. And she went back to her room in the dark. And she lay down. And she thought about what it meant to know exactly how much time there was, and to intend to use every hour of it. She did not sleep for a long time, but when she did, it was the sleep of a woman who has stopped calculating whether to fight and started calculating how. The documents were gone from the equipment barn on the morning of the 42nd day. Sykes had been in the hills above the ranch 2 nights running. Calhoun had seen the lantern both evenings, dismissed it as a line rider from the neighboring property, and had been wrong. Whoever Sykes had told, and whoever they had sent, they had come in the small hours when the cold kept everyone inside, and they had known precisely where to look. Calhoun found the empty space behind the wheel press before breakfast and came to the kitchen with the particular stillness of a man absorbing something he had not prepared for. He did not have to say it. Evangeline looked at his face and understood and set down the coffee pot and went to her room and lifted the floorboard and found the box exactly where she had left it and came back to the kitchen. They looked at each other across the table. "Sykes," she said, "or someone Sykes told." He sat down. His hands were flat on the table. "They were there yesterday. I checked at dusk. Then, sometime in the night." He nodded. The muscle in his jaw worked once. She thought about the box in her hand, about the 42 days that had led to this morning, about Nora asleep down the hall, burning through her remaining time, with the particular dignity of someone who has decided that the manner of a thing matters as much as the outcome. She thought about 11 days becoming 10, and 10 becoming this morning, and this morning being the morning it all moved. "He'll come today," she said. "Yes." "Not to talk." "No." She put the box on the table between them. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "I sent a letter to Aldous Garrett 3 days ago," she said. He looked up from the box. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly more the adjustment of a man recalibrating a calculation. "You didn't tell me." "No." "Why not?" "Because I wasn't sure whether Hale had gotten to you again," she said. She said it plainly without apology, because that was the only way to say a true thing about distrust. "I needed him to receive it before I could be sure of anything." He held her eyes. The gray of them in the morning light was not cold. It was the color of something weathered and still standing. "And now," he said, Now I'm sure." She pushed the box to the side. The letter told Garrett that a witness of long standing in Granger was prepared to submit documentation to the federal court regarding systematic land fraud. I asked him to arrive 2 days ahead of his announced schedule and to come to this ranch first. She paused. He wrote back. The reply came yesterday. Calhoun was quiet for a moment. "You've been running 2 timelines." "I've been running as many timelines as the situation required," she said. "Your father's documents are gone. But Nora is the origin. She heard the original conversation. She has 40 years of this valley's history in her memory, and she is prepared to testify to every piece of it that she witnessed directly." She looked at him steadily. "The documents were evidence. Nora is testimony, and testimony from a woman who has lived in this valley her entire life, who is known by every family from here to the county line, carries weight that paper alone cannot." He sat with this. Outside, the first light was coming over the ridge, that thin pre-dawn gray that preceded color. A rooster from the direction of the neighboring property called once and was not answered. "When does Garrett arrive?" he said. "Today. Sometime before noon if the road held." He stood. He went to the high shelf and took down the Colt and checked the cylinder with the practiced ease of a man who has done this long enough that it requires no thought. He set it back. He took his coat from the hook. "Then we have time," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "To make sure Nora has breakfast." Nora ate with the appetite of someone who has decided, regardless of circumstance, to maintain the ordinary rituals of living. She had eggs and toast and 2 cups of coffee, and she listened to what Evangeline told her about the documents and the letter to Garrett with the expression of a woman receiving news she has been expecting and is now simply confirming. When Evangeline finished, Nora set down her cup. "He'll send someone this morning," she said. "Before Garrett arrives. He'll want the box, and he'll want me quiet." "I know. The box is empty. I am the opposite of quiet." She said it without theatrics, simply as a matter of current fact. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to be ready to speak," Evangeline said. "I need you to be specific. Dates, names, the exact words you heard in that hall in 1874 as best you can render them. I need you to be the kind of witness that a man like Aldous Garrett takes seriously. I've been rehearsing that conversation in my mind for 15 years, Nora said. I believe I can manage specific. Calhoun at the window said, "Someone's coming up the road." They came 3. 2 men Evangeline did not recognize on good horses, moving with the unhurried efficiency of people who have been given instructions and intend to follow them. And behind them on the roan he always rode Douglas Hale. He was dressed well. He was always dressed well. The dark wool coat, the good hat, the boots that cost more than most men in that county earned in a month. He rode with the ease of a man who owns the road he is on, which in a practical sense he did. The road passed through land whose notes he held, whose owners owed him consideration and knew it. Calhoun went out first. He stood at the top of the porch steps with his thumbs in his belt and his expression flat, and he waited. Hale reined in at the base of the steps. He looked at Calhoun for a moment, then passed him at the door. He did not look for Evangeline, which told her he did not know exactly where she was, and she stayed where she was, just inside the window to the left of the door where she could hear everything and remain unlocated. "Calhoun," Hale said, pleasantly, as if this were the Tuesday supper, as if the men behind him were not sitting their horses with the particular posture of men who have been told to be ready. Douglas, I understand there's been a development regarding some materials that were in your possession. He said it the way he said everything manageable, civic, reasonable men having a reasonable conversation. I'd like to discuss it. There's nothing to discuss, Calhoun said. You have what you came for. I don't know what you think is still here. Hale looked at him. The composed expression did not shift. I think, he said, that there's a woman in that house who came here from Boston with intentions that go beyond the domestic. And I think the more interesting materials are not the ones we recovered last night. He paused. I'd like to speak with Miss Marsh. Miss Marsh is occupied. I imagine she is. He swung down from the horse. The two men behind him did not dismount, which meant they had been told not to unless necessary, which meant Hale still believed this could be managed with words. He was wrong, but he did not know that yet. He came up the steps. Calhoun did not move. Calhoun, his voice was still pleasant, but underneath it now was something that had given up on the performance. I've been patient with this family for a very long time. I've carried that note since 1882, when I didn't have to, when I could have called it, and taken the North Quarter and been done with it. I've been a reasonable neighbor. He stopped one step below Calhoun, looking up at him, and the pleasantness was entirely gone now. I am asking you to be a reasonable man. You held the note because the North Quarter is worth more than the balance on the note, Calhoun said. You held it because carrying debt over a man's head is cheaper than a legal dispute and quieter than the alternative. He said it without anger, simply the way a man states a thing he has known for a long time and is now saying aloud for the first time. I know what you did to my father. Something moved in Hale's face. Not guilt men like Hale had reorganized themselves around guilt long ago, so that it no longer arrived in the usual form. What moved was calculation, a rapid, invisible adjustment to a new set of conditions. Careful, he said. I have been, Calhoun said. I've been careful for 7 years. I'm done. From the road came the sound of a second group of horses. Hale turned. Calhoun turned. Evangeline moved from the window to the door. 4 riders coming up from the south, moving at a pace that was not urgent, but was deliberate, the pace of men with authority, and no reason to hurry. The man at the front was perhaps 65, gray-bearded, wearing a coat with the particular cut of someone accustomed to federal facilities and formal occasions. He rode a dark bay with an easy confidence. Behind him, 2 men in the dress of federal marshals and a 4th in clerk's clothing with a leather satchel across his saddle. Aldous Garrett Circuit, judge of the Federal District Court, came up the road of the Briggs Ranch on the 42nd morning and reined in beside Douglas Hale's horse with the expression of a man who has arrived to find exactly the situation he was told he would find. He looked at Hale. He looked at the 2 men on horses who were now trying to arrange themselves in ways that did not look like what they were. He looked at Calhoun on the steps, and then his eyes moved to the door where Evangeline stood, and she gave him the small nod she had described in her letter. The nod that meant, yes, I am who wrote to you, and yes, it is, as I said, and yes, we are ready. Garrett dismounted. He handed his reins to the marshal behind him. He came to the base of the steps, and he looked at Hale with the expression of a man who has seen many versions of this particular conversation in many particular places, and has long since stopped finding any of them surprising. "Douglas," he said. "Aldous." Hale's voice was controlled. A man who has controlled his voice for decades does not lose that control easily, even when the ground shifts. "I wasn't aware you were arriving today." "I adjusted my schedule," Garrett said. He looked at the two horsemen. "These men work for you." A pause. "They're associates." "Then I'd ask your associates to ride back to town." He said it the way federal judges say things, not as a request, and not quite as an order. In the space between that leaves no practical alternative. The horseman looked at Hale. Hale, after a moment that cost him something, made a small gesture with his hand. They turned their horses and went. Garrett came up the steps. He nodded to Calhoun. He looked at Evangeline. "Miss Marsh," he said, "your letter was specific, and in my experience specificity is either the mark of honesty or extraordinary preparation. I am here to determine which." "Both, I hope," she said. Something in his expression approximated approval. "I'd like to sit down," he said. "I'd like coffee if there is any, and I'd like to hear from the witness you mentioned in her own words, starting from the beginning." Nora told it from the beginning. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and her back straight, and she told it the way she had rehearsed it in her mind for 15 years, which was to say, completely and in order, and without ornamentation. The hall in 1874. The voice she had recognized as Hale's and the voice she had not recognized as Orrin Peck's. The words she had heard which she rendered as close to verbatim as memory, and 15 years allowed and which she was careful to qualify where qualification was honest. Samuel Whitmore's name, the instruction to resolve the matter, the date. Then she told the rest, not the hall. What came after the hall? The years of watching, the accumulation piece by piece of every transaction she had witnessed, or could document through the county records that were public, and the private correspondence she had managed to access over 2 decades. Through the particular invisibility that women of her age and position possess, in rooms where men conduct business. Dates. Names. The pattern of it assembled from fragments into something coherent and damning. Garrett's clerk wrote without pause. One of the marshals took notes of his own. Hale sat at the far end of the table. He had been invited to sit because Garrett had insisted on it better to have him in the room than outside where he might leave and where leaving might require a conversation about why. He sat with his hands in his lap and his face arranged into the expression of a man listening to something inaccurate but too composed to dispute it without preparation. And Evangeline watched him from across the table and thought he is counting what he has and what he can afford to lose, and what can be salvaged. He is still calculating. Men like Hale do not stop calculating. They simply run out of things to calculate with. The documents that Sykes had taken the previous night were, Garrett noted, obtained without legal authorization, and under circumstances that would need to be addressed separately. Their theft did not affect their content, which was on record in the letter Evangeline had sent him, which letter constituted the summary of a witness account, which account was being provided in person before a federal officer. Hale said at one point carefully, "This is the testimony of one woman whose medical situation may affect her reliability and the correspondence of a deceased inquiry agent whose methods were not subject to oversight." Garrett looked at him for a moment. "That observation will be noted and considered," he said, "alongside the observation that you appear to have gone to considerable effort to prevent this testimony from reaching me, which is itself a matter I find instructive." Hale said nothing more. When Nora finished, the kitchen was quiet for a time. The fire had burned low and Calhoun added wood without being asked. And the flames took hold again, and the warmth in the room had a different quality than it had before. Not the warmth of an ordinary morning, but of something that had been dammed and was now moving. Garrett looked at his notes. He looked at his clerk's notes. He looked at Hale with the measured regard of a man who has reached a conclusion and is giving it one final examination before acting on it. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I'm going to ask you to accompany Marshal Deeds to Cheyenne, where I'll have additional questions for you in a more formal setting." He said it plainly, not unkindly, but without concession. "I'm also going to place a hold on any transactions or transfers from the First Granger Bank until this matter is examined. That will be communicated to the bank officers by end of day." Hale stood. He straightened his coat. He put on his hat. He looked at Evangeline across the table with an expression that she could not read precisely. Not anger, not contempt. Something more complex and more interior. The look of a man who is reviewing where the calculation failed and where he might have done differently. He did not speak to her. He did not speak to Nora. He walked to the door with his particular bearing intact. Because men who have held themselves a certain way for 50 years do not stop at the end, and Marshal Deeds followed him out, and the door closed behind them with an ordinary sound that somehow carried a great deal of weight. The room was very quiet. Calhoun was at the window. Evangeline was at the table. Nora had not moved from her chair, and she sat with her hands still folded in her lap and her back still straight. And on her face was the expression that Evangeline thought she would carry with her for a long time afterward. Not triumph. Nothing as simple as triumph. Something quieter and older. The expression of a woman who has put down something very heavy and is learning in real time what her hands feel like without it. Garrett finished with his clerk and his notes and the documentation of what had been said and by whom. He was thorough and unhurried and professional. And when he was done, he stood and thanked Nora in the way that people who understand what testimony costs thank the person who has given it. "The legal process from here will take time," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that. These matters rarely resolve quickly, but the federal court has jurisdiction, and what has been provided here today is substantive. I believe we can work with it." Nora nodded. "I have lived here for 58 years, she said. "I have some experience with time." Something shifted in Garrett's expression that might, in another context, have been described as warmth. He and his party rode out before noon. The sound of the horses on the road faded gradually, replaced by the ordinary sounds of the ranch wind. A horse shifting in the barn, the creak of the porch boards in the cold. Calhoun was still at the window. Nora said, "I think I'd like to sit outside for a while." She said it with the tone of someone making a practical request rather than a significant one, but Evangeline understood what it was. The desire to be in the air, in the light, in the space of a place she had tended and fought for, and had not been certain on certain mornings she would see through to this day. She helped Nora with her coat. Calhoun brought the chair from the porch and set it where the sun was finding the south wall of the house, out of the wind, and Nora sat in it and closed her eyes and turned her face up to the October light. They left her there. They went back inside. In the kitchen, Calhoun poured 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of Evangeline and sat across from her, and they drank in the quiet, which was a different kind of quiet than the kitchen had held before. Not the taut quiet of something withheld, but the settled quiet of something done. She thought about what Garrett had said, that it would take time, that the process was slow. She thought about the note from 1882, which was still on the books at First Granger Bank, which Hale no longer controlled, which a receiver would now manage while the federal examination proceeded. The note, she said. Still there, Calhoun said. You know that. Yes. The bank will appoint someone to manage the portfolio. They may be more willing to negotiate terms. They may. He turned the cup in his hands. And they may not. That's the work of the next several years. He said it without complaint as a simple statement of the terrain ahead. This ranch has been in this family for 31 years. It'll hold. She looked at him. You lost the discharge. I know what I lost. He looked at her steadily. The night I took those documents out of your box and put them behind the wheel press, I knew what Hale would do when he found them gone. I knew he'd withdraw the offer. He paused. I made the choice with full information. And you made it for your father. Something moved in his face. Not the quick movement of a man caught in a sentiment, but the slow movement of a man allowing something that has been kept internal to exist briefly in the visible world. Partly, he said, partly for my father. He set down the cup. Partly because I looked at that envelope and I thought about the last time I had to decide between what was easy and what was right. And I remembered what I chose then and what it cost. He looked at the table. I told you once that I left the Pinkertons because I did what I was told, when I should have done what I knew. He looked up. I am not going to be that man again. She was quiet. The note will get paid, he said, year by year. The way everything on this ranch gets done. Outside, through the window, Nora was still sitting in the sun, her face tilted up, her hands resting open in her lap. The way hands rest when they have finally released something they have held for a very long time. That afternoon, she walked the fence line alone for the first time, not checking anything, not looking for anything, just walking. The cold was the same cold it had always been. The ridge was the same ridge, but the particular quality of the silence had changed the way silence changes when the thing you have been bracing for has finally arrived and passed through. 3 weeks passed in the way of early winter, the work continuing regardless of what the work was in service of. Because ranches do not pause for consequence or resolution. Cattle needed feed. Fences needed checking. The first real snow came not as the exploratory dusting of October, but as the genuine article, heavy and purposeful, 2 feet in 2 days. And every hand on the property worked through it. And Evangeline worked with them. and by the end of the second day she could not feel her feet and could not stop. She had written to Ruth Calcott in Providence. She had written to the other women. She had told them what had happened as much as could be told in a letter which was less than the thing itself, but enough. Ruth had written back with the brevity of a woman who understood that brevity was sometimes more appropriate than expression. Good, she had written. I knew it would be you. Garrett sent word from Cheyenne. The examination was proceeding. 3 additional witnesses had come forward following Hale's arrival in the capital, men who had dealt with the bank over the years, and who, finding that the ground had shifted, had decided that their own silence no longer served them. The north quarter of the Briggs Ranch was confirmed clear of any outstanding claim. The receiver managing the bank portfolio had been instructed to consider reasonable arrangements with current note holders. Nora received this news in her chair by the south wall, on one of the days when the sun found a gap in the clouds and the snow on the ridge blazed white against the blue. She did not celebrate. She was not a woman for celebration in the usual sense. She sat with it the way she sat with most things, quietly, fully letting it be what it was. She was getting weaker. Not quickly, not in the dramatic way of stories, but in the steady, incremental way of a real process. A little less at breakfast, a little more time in the chair, a little more assistance with the coat. She did not complain. She asked sometimes to be told things again about Cheyenne, about the examination, about the families on the South Road, whose land situations had been mentioned in Garrett's communications. She wanted to know how it was going. She wanted to stay informed. Evangeline told her everything. On the morning that would become the last genuinely warm morning before the deep cold locked in, Nora asked to be helped to the south field. Not far, just to the fence line, just to the edge of the aspen stand that Ira Briggs had planted when the ranch was young and the country was newer than it had any right to be. Calhoun walked on one side of her, Evangeline on the other. They moved slowly. The snow had been packed down by the ranch hands, and the going was manageable, and when they reached the fence, Nora put her hand on the top rail and looked at the bare aspens and was quiet for a while. He planted them the year I turned 10, she said. I thought they were the ugliest trees I'd ever seen, just sticks coming out of the ground. She looked at them. Then spring came. Calhoun put his hand over hers on the rail. They stood there for a time that was not long in minutes, but was complete in the way that some moments are complete, containing everything that could be said within the boundary of the silence, so that what was said was not necessary, but could simply be felt. Then the cold reasserted itself and they went back. She had been in Granger for 63 days when she packed her bag. This was practical, not decided. She had a bag and things in it, and the things needed to be organized, and organizing them was something she had always done when she needed to think, because her hands required occupation when her mind was doing its serious work. She put in the clothes, the sewing kit, the small journal Thomas had given her the first winter of their marriage, which she had mostly used as a record-keeping document, but which had in the past 2 months acquired a few pages of a different character. She did not put in the box. The box was empty and had been empty since the 42nd morning, and she was not sure what to do with an empty box that had carried the weight it had carried, and so she left it on the dresser. She sat on the bed with the packed bag beside her and looked at the window and the ridge beyond it. white now, the aspens bare against the gray sky. She thought about Boston, the flat in Cambridge that she had sublet to a schoolteacher before she left. The smell of the harbor in winter, cold and organic and immense. The specific quality of a city that had nothing to do with her anymore. Not unkindly, simply in the way that places you have outgrown have nothing to do with you anymore. She thought about Ruth Calcott in Providence, who had loaned her money and faith in equal measure. She would need to return the money. The faith was its own category. She thought about what Nora had said to her the night after Garrett rode out when they had sat together in the low lamp of her bedroom. A woman who intends to leave doesn't tell the man everything, and then watch him choose. She had said it with the precision of someone who had been thinking about people and their choices for a very long time, and had developed a high degree of accuracy. She heard Calhoun come in from the barn. She heard him in the kitchen. The sound of the stove, the pump at the sink, the ordinary acoustic furniture of a life being lived in a place where a life had always been lived. She sat with the pack bag for a while longer. Then she heard his step in the hall. He knocked, which was courtesy. The door was open. He leaned against the door frame. He looked at the bag. His face made no particular movement, but she had been watching his face for 63 days, and she could read what no movement meant. "The southbound comes through at 2, he said. "I know. That's 3 hours. Yes." He looked at the bag, then at her. The gray eyes in the winter light were very clear, not demanding, not closed, open in the way that a cleared space is open, not empty but available. "If you went," he said, "I would understand it." He said it carefully, as a man says something he has prepared because he wants to say it correctly. "You came here to do a thing and you did it, and there is no claim on you after that." He paused. "But I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. All right. If none of this had happened," he said, "if there had been no documents, no Hale, no Garrett, if you had come here the way the advertisement suggested, a woman looking for a life in a country she didn't know, and a man who needed someone capable of hard work and independent judgment, if it had just been that," he held her eyes, "would you have stayed?" The room was very quiet. She thought about the aspens in the October light, the stew that Nora had made the first night, and the particular warmth of that kitchen, and the way Calhoun had moved through it without waste, without performance. She thought about falling off the horse and lying in the dry grass, looking at the Wyoming sky. She thought about the accounts she had rebuilt from the disordered crate of receipts, the satisfaction of making a true thing out of a confused one. She thought about 2 cups of coffee on a morning when everything was over, and the quiet between them had a different quality than quiet had ever had before. She thought about the box on the dresser. Then she reached over and picked up the bag. She stood. She walked to the dresser and set the bag down, and took the box and put it in the bag. Then she looked at him. "I'm going to need to write to Ruth Calcott," she said. "I owe her money and I intend to pay it back." Something in his face shifted. It was not a large movement. It was the particular movement of a man who has held himself very still for a long time and has decided that the moment for stillness is past. "I have wire at the desk," he said, "and postage." Good. She closed the bag. I'll need the east room. You have the east room. I'll need it past this winter. He was quiet for a moment. The east room is not negotiable, he said. It has the best light on the ridge. She looked at him and he looked at her, and between them was 63 days of a country that had tried to break them both and had not managed it, and a question that had been asked and answered in the only language that made sense in a place like this. Not words, but the simple, irrevocable act of staying. She picked up the bag. She was not leaving. She was simply redistributing its contents into a space that was going to require, for the foreseeable future, all of them. The winter came in full that week, the kind that the old ranchers called a working winter, the kind that asked everything of you and returned the asking with clarity and knowledge of what you were made of that could not be acquired any other way. Nora did not see spring. She died on a Tuesday in February in her room with the lamp low and the window showing the stars over the ridge. Calhoun was on one side of the bed and Evangeline was on the other, and she went the way she had lived steadily, without drama fully present, until she was not. The last thing she said was practical, a question about whether the south fence had been checked before the storm, and when Calhoun told her it had, she nodded and the nod was complete. They buried her in the stand of aspens his father had planted. The ground was hard, and the work was hard, and they did it themselves, the two of them in the January cold. And when it was done, they stood at the edge of the trees for a while, in the way they had stood there, with her when she was alive, and the aspens were bare and white against the gray sky, and they were very still. The legal proceedings in Cheyenne moved through the winter with the pace of federal process, which is deliberate by design, and sometimes by obstruction. And Hale's attorneys made the arguments that Hale's attorneys were paid to make, and Garrett's court made the determinations that the evidence supported. And in March, a judgment was entered that returned to the record the names of 11 families whose land had been acquired through fraudulent documentation over the course of 15 years. The banknote on the Briggs property was settled in a renegotiated arrangement that reduced the balance by a third and extended the term by 4 years, which was not absolution, but was manageable, and manageable was what the work of a ranch in Wyoming required. On the first genuinely warm day of April, when the snow had pulled back from the south slopes, and the aspens were showing the first small green that preceded their leaves, Evangeline stood at the kitchen window and watched Calhoun come in from the morning rounds. And she thought about a woman who had boarded a train in Boston, wearing a borrowed name and carrying something dangerous and necessary. And she thought about all the distances she had traveled that were not measured in miles. She thought about Thomas, who had spent 2 years assembling the fragments of a case he would never see completed, who had understood that the work mattered regardless of whether he would be present at its conclusion. She thought about what it meant to carry something forward on behalf of someone who could no longer carry it, and what it meant when the carrying was finally done, and what you were left with in the space where the weight had been. What you were left with, she understood, was the space itself, available, open, ready for whatever came next. Calhoun came into the kitchen and hung his coat. He went to the stove. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her place at the table with the ease of a man who has done the same thing enough times that it has become the grammar of his daily life. She sat down. He sat across from her. Outside, the aspens were beginning faint green against the white that was still on the ridge, reaching in the particular way that Ira Briggs had noted. And his sister had remembered, and his son had inherited without knowing the way. Certain things are inherited not through instruction, but through the example of staying, of refusing to be moved, of being here in the spring when spring came. They drank their coffee. The work was waiting as it always was. The accounts needed finishing. The south fence needed checking. The new calf in the east barn needed the attention of someone with steady hands and patience, which described them both in their different ways. There was a great deal of it. The work, the kind that does not end and was never meant to end, the kind that is not a burden but a shape, the shape of a life in a place that asks everything of you, and if you stay, gives everything back. She picked up her cup. She stayed.